Welcome to The Bridge. We are a show which connects East and West. My name is Jason. I'm originally from sunny California, living in beautiful Beijing. Today we have a special guest with us today, Dr. Mark Levine, heralding from California also. Dr. Levine is a trained sociologist who has turned singer-songwriter, having written more than 70 songs about China and performed in more than 15 provinces on radio and on television. He works as a professor at Minzu University and has written more than 20 articles about China and more than one book, right?
Yeah, a couple of books.
He's lived in China for nearly two decades and actively seeks to build bridges between the country of his birth, the U.S., and his chosen home, China. Welcome to The Bridge, Dr. Levine.
I'm thrilled to be here, and please call me Mark.
Okay, Mark. So after you, first question, after you got your PhD, you worked as a sociologist, a public sociologist. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why you did it?
Sure. Actually, the term public sociologist didn't exist at the time that I began doing that, and I first heard it when somebody referred to me as that, I think in the 90s, probably late 90s, when I was invited to a sociology conference. But after getting my PhD and having taught for a couple of years and looking at what was going on around the United States and changes, economic changes and so on, and without going into the finer points, basically I decided that change was needed in the United States, and I wasn't going to be in a position to be able to do that within the structure of a university system. So I left. I was teaching in Albany, New York, was married at the time, had a young child, and we drove from Albany, New York back to California. And throughout the trip, we stopped at all kinds of food co-ops and tenant organizations and organizations that were fighting against police brutality and all different kinds of things. And finally, we ended up visited family, and then went up to Lake Tahoe, which I presume you're familiar with, where I had a friend who was working as the public defender there, and he invited us to stay with him, and I spent a couple of weeks enjoying that experience and chopping wood for him, and I had muscles at that time. It was really good. And after 2 weeks, my wife and I looked at each other and said, "This is really nice, but this isn't why we drove across the country." And we went back to the Oakland, Berkeley area, which I'm sure you're also familiar with.
It's a lovely area.
1976, which was the kind of the end of the hotbed of political activity and that
Disco.
area. And we were basically found an organization that was organizing on a much broader scale than just tenant unions or against police brutality, and that was trying to work with low-income workers to not, I said with, not for, all right, to build an organization which on the one hand could provide some immediate needs, and at the same time would actively work to oppose various government policies, whether it be on a state level or a federal level or a local level, that we saw were only going to make conditions for low-income people worse.
Could you give one example?
Sure. Let me think about it for a moment. I know I was recently thinking about this. Well, actually, let me deal with a different kinds of thing, a different example. In the 1980s, in the city of Philadelphia, all right, there was an organization. It was called MOVE, all right? And if anybody looks up online, M-O-O-V, MOVE, bombing. And what happened, it was a mostly African-American organization, and it was kind of countercultural and political, and they had a house in a working-class area, a largely black working class area, and they had various run-ins with the police, and suddenly a bomb was dropped by the police on their home.
Dropped, like from a helicopter.
Helicopter, right? Dropped on their house, and the house burned, and people were, the fire department came out, and the city said, don't put the fire out and let the fire burn. And some people died from the fire. Some people died as they tried to run out and shoot. and they were shot. And as a result, and some people went to prison, but none of the government officials who dropped a bomb. And 2 square blocks of houses, working class people's houses, were burned.
You know, I've seen the photo
destroyed.
of what you're talking about, but I didn't know the context.
Okay. And what happens a lot of times, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, we have particular tendency in the United States when there is some kind of problem. Usually our first response is not how do we fix this? Our first response, and we saw this with COVID, who do we blame for this? So there was going back and blaming this particular official, or is it the mayor, or is it the police, or is it the state of Pennsylvania? And in the meantime, people were suffering. People were suffering. So my organization joined with others and said, the first thing we have to do, we've got to deal with who caused this, who's responsible. It's a terrible thing. And at the same time, our first thing has to deal with the fact that 2 square blocks of working class people have just had everything they own destroyed. What's going to happen to them? So we began to organize collections of canned goods and clothing and toys for children and all different kinds of stuff, household supplies and books, and organized airlifts from throughout California and Oregon. Most of them were organized from the San Francisco Bay Area, either the San Francisco or the Oakland airport. And I personally played a key role in terms of getting the airlines. We had about 6 or 7 different airlines, some freight companies and some passenger airlines who agreed, we'll give us a ton of supplies.
Wow.
We will take them. We had an affiliated organization in Philadelphia, and we would coordinate bringing them all to the central location and moving those. So this was one particular kind of example that we would deal with.
Wow.
So
That's quite impressive. I'm very moved by that. That's actually similar to what's going on right now in terms of providing aid for earthquake victims in Syria and Turkey.
Yes. We also had, I don't know, you mentioned it was probably before your time, but in speaking of earthquake, thank you for reminding me of that. 1989, there was an earthquake.
I remember.
It's called the Loma Prieta earthquake. It was south of San Francisco and near Santa Cruz and so on. But the damage was all over.
Yeah.
I had an apartment in San Francisco, and one of the walls along 75 stairs to get to my apartment was no longer flat. Right, had this indentation. I had, I'm sure you remember, portion of the Bay Bridge collapsed. I had a friend who was on the bridge at that time. Fortunately, he was okay. A large section of a freeway collapsed. A double-decker freeway collapsed, and in general, because of the availability of engineering technology and money and so on, unlike what's happening today in Turkey and Syria, or what happened in China with the Wenchuan earthquake, we get lots of financial damage, and both immediate and long-term, because sometimes businesses are closed, people lose their jobs. The actual loss of life tends to be a much smaller one in the U.S. for earthquakes, but still people are losing their lives. So as a result, one of the things that we dealt with was, and the primary government organization responsible at the federal level is called the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and they are supposed to provide aid, and they tended to provide some aid, but working class communities and minority communities tended to get almost nothing. And in some cases, people were given what were called grants, and a year later they got a letter saying, well, your grant has been converted to a loan, so now you have to pay it back. So we did a massive amount of both advocacy.
Isn't that illegal ex post facto?
Not when the government doesn't. And you got to have the resources to fight those things. I'm not saying government doesn't do illegal things, of course, but you got to have resources to fight it. All right? And so that's what happened. This happened with the Hurricane Katrina, all kinds of natural disasters. And
Sounds like very important work that you were doing.
Yeah, so we're doing. I basically did disaster relief, not digging people out of fallen, collapsed buildings, but providing various resources, organizing those resources, and at the same time doing a lot of advocacy, all right, to get the government to do what the government was supposed to do.
Well, my next question was going to be, do you feel like you've made a meaningful impact? But I think that it's clear to anyone listening that the answer is yes. But would you like to elaborate on that?
Yes and no. Why do I say no? Because we have to look at what exists today. So in the long run, we didn't particularly permanently solve problems, and that was our objective, was to permanently solve the problems of low-income workers and their families in the United States. On the level of individuals and various communities during the time period that I was participating, oh yes, very, very, very much so. We had another instance. We had one of our volunteers were 100% volunteer, including me. And my position was no different than anybody else, even though I had a PhD and a university education. And many of our volunteers were people who had been domestic workers or farm workers or unemployed people themselves, as well as students and housewives and doctors and so on. But we had
Certainly you need pro bono lawyers as well.
Yeah.
Stand up for people's rights.
Excuse me. So one of our volunteers, our organizers, had been a domestic worker and had worked in various social service offices. And she was in her 60s, and she developed a tumor. And she she was on the Medi-Cal program, which is a state-provided program for medical care, which has serious limitations. And she was living in Oakland, where our office was actually based, and she went to the county hospital in Oakland, and she went there, and they did examinations, and they said, you have this brain tumor. And the doctor said, that's it, you got this brain tumor. And the family is there, and they're saying, what can you do? And they're saying nothing, and she's in her 60s, and she's poor, and she's old, and she's black, and we really want to help her and give her a longer life. And the hospitals have these special people. They're called utilization and review, or at least they were at the time. And what they would come in and do and say, well, possibly something could be done, but we don't have the resources for that. So why are you being so selfish? She had a long life. Why don't you just let her go? All right, you're just doing this for your own sake. And I was in meetings where I heard these people from the hospital. They're not medical staff. They deal with the government, the link
claims.
between, yes, but this was the government insurance, right? And so we worked with another organization of medical professionals to help. We advocated, okay, we want to get a second opinion, okay? And there is a doctor across the bay in San Francisco who specializes in this. He is the person who wrote the book on this particular kind of tumor in the brain, and he should get the opportunity to examine her. And so that meant moving her to another hospital. So you have to deal, first of all, the doctor in the hospital who was there where she was has to approve that. All right? And he said, I want to prove it. And he said, don't you believe she has a second opinion, has the right to a second opinion? And he says, yes, if she can pay for it. So she wouldn't be allowed to be released.
Unless she could pay the Medicaid back.
Unless she could pay the money for that. And not just back, but to transfer and everything. And Medicare or Medi-Cal then wouldn't pay for the service in the hospital. This was at University of San Francisco, the big
One
medical
of the best
center,
universities
hospitals.
yeah.
And it's all a medical university. And finally, after discussions with the man who wrote the book, he said, oh, this is wrong. This is wrong. And
morally and ethically
he contacted, and he says, and maybe there's nothing that can be done. And he contacted the other doctor. And the other doctor, of course, knew him and knew of his status in the field. And he said, "You're going to release her. And you're going to transfer her to San Francisco, to the University of San Francisco Hospital." So finally, the man, under that pressure, which we were able to help organize, she was released. Doctor looked at her and said, "Let's schedule a surgery." They scheduled a surgery. And she was able to live 10 years longer and was able to interact with her grandchildren and her children, right, and the grandchildren. And she was not as mobile and not as lucid and clear as she had been previously. But she knew who we were. She was able to talk. She was able to enjoy the presence of her family, play with her grandchildren. Okay, so a variety of instances like that. But we also dealt with larger scales things, food distributions, and and it wasn't just helping to get medical resources, but optical resources and dental resources, clothing. People who had job interviews, but they couldn't even go for an interview because they didn't have appropriate clothes for it.
Yeah.
So we would organize clothing drives at schools and at churches, or we would get a clothing store saying, "Can you give this man a suit?"
Yeah.
Right? Because it's going to help him get a job,
Change
which
his
is
entire life,
not just
potentially.
his life.
Yeah.
It's your life. Why? Because now he's working. He
Yeah.
can pay taxes. He can buy things, right? So a lot of our interaction was not just with a low-income community, but it was also with business people. That the more money exists in this community, the more people that have an income. Well, you know what's going to happen in your neighborhood? Crime's going to go down.
Yeah.
Your insurance costs will go down.
This is from the
You'll get
Sociology
more-
PhD.
You'll get more customers.
Yeah.
All right. And you'll live in a just happier and more comfortable and safer neighborhood. And that's going to be good for everybody, not just them, you. So we're doing this. So you're part of this.